Good evening, APUSH history folks. This is the last part of Unit 5, which is going to talk about Reconstruction. And in the review packet that I'm about to give you tomorrow in class, which will be Thursday, there are 3 pages. The first page deals with the first video, which is about why there's a civil war. The second one deals with why the North wins that civil war. And the third one deals with a more complex issue. To cheat, reading it straight off of the sheet, off of my laptop. Actually, here I go. The Civil War and Reconstruction ended slavery and the notion of a divisible nation, but left unresolved questions of relative power and largely unchanged social and economic patterns. The constitutional changes of Reconstruction led to conflicts over new definitions of citizenship. So to take that apart, the Civil War and Reconstruction ended slavery and the notion of a divisible nation. In other words, it settled the issue of whether or not you could nullify federal laws and leave the federal union. You could not. But it left unresolved questions of relative power. In other words, how powerful is the federal government? Can the federal government force states to do things? As we'll see here in a moment, can they force them to accommodate changes to African American life? Can they force them to allow voting rights for African Americans? How much work is it going to take for the federal government to make the states do what they should do in the South? And, last part of it here, largely unchanged social and economic patterns. In other words, African Americans are going to be free from slavery, yes, and eventually here they're going to be citizens, yes, but their lives are going to be largely unchanged in an economic and social sense because it's not going to be anything different from what we saw prior to the Civil War. The constitutional changes of Reconstruction led to conflicts over new definitions of citizenship. In other words, we're going to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but largely unsettled in that will be how we make those things real. How do we take the language that's in the Constitution and turn it into something other than just language? How do we make it practical? How do we make African Americans equal in the South? How do we get Southerners to be a part of that? A lot of difficult questions there. So we're starting on the bottom of page 4 here, ladies and gentlemen, as I switch focus here and move over to the study guide. You got a fly bugging me here. Go away, fly. Pardon me. But what did the 13th Amendment do? Ban slavery. Moving along. What struggles did the freedmen of the South face in regards to gaining land and finding work? So this is going back to my main idea here. What remains unchanged? There's a lot of freedmen, 3.5 to 4 million of them. They're economically not set to do anything besides what they probably did prior to the Civil War, and that is farming cotton. The South is not going to change its economic way of making money. The Civil War hasn't changed the fact that Southern cotton is still an incredibly valuable and sought-after commodity. So that means that Southerners are going to continue to be cotton-based, and they're going to be very hands-on, if you will, in the farming and the processing of the cotton. And that means that African Americans are going to fill into those roles. So when we talk here about a largely unchanged social and economic conditions, one of the things we're mentioning is that African Americans economically are not going to have new opportunities. They're not going to have land, and they're not going to have different kinds of jobs, unfortunately, from what they had beforehand. At the top of page 5, discuss the growing struggle between the president and the radical Republicans. President Andrew Johnson believes that Reconstruction should be something that is fairly simple. Let's let the southern states back into the Union. Let's make them accommodate the 13th Amendment. And then after that, let's just let it be. Johnson, although he is no fan of wealthy southern plantation aristocratic style folks out of the South, does not believe it should be the business of the federal government to go into the South on a state-by-state basis, hold them to do exactly what they should be doing. And that now comes down to the other issue that we have here on our sheet, the idea of whether or not the federal government has the right and whether or not it has the power, right? We talked about this relative power. Does it have the right and the power to go into the states and to make them do things? This is where we get into an issue that we've been dealing from since day one. How strong is the central federal government of the United States? In a sense, the Civil War christens a new nation, a new, much stronger federal government than had existed before, even if that's only in its perception of power and not necessarily in the reality of its power. But it's still going to struggle with the day-to-day reality of trying to get southern states to do what the Congress wants them to do. We'll give examples of that here in a moment. But first, on the other side of the aisle, the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans believe that Southerners should be made to really pay for the war, not necessarily in land or in money, but that there should be a radical remaking of the South. The Southerners should change the social background of the South. They should look to economically change the focus of the South to perhaps become a more industrialized Northern-style economy. And at the same time, that the President and the Congress should be working together to push that to happen. You end up with a huge power struggle where Andrew Johnson seems to be taking a much more relaxed line on Reconstruction, and the radical Republican congressmen, primarily from the North, are going to take a much more aggressive line. They want Southerners to change the way that they've done business over the years. They believe that's the purpose of what the war was there to do. What's the content and the purpose of the 14th Amendment? It grants equal protection under the law, in essence, citizenship, to any person who is born in the United States or is naturalized a citizen. Now, going back to the prior ruling on that, the Dred Scott decision of the 1850s, the 14th Amendment takes away that idea. Dred Scott decision had said that African Americans were not capable of citizenship, I beg your pardon. That's replaced here by the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment is in its language a fairly clear enunciation of the fact that the states should, on a case-by-case basis, offer the principles of citizenship and the protection of the Constitution to individuals regardless of which state they are. In other words, to put this hopefully as clearly as I can, the fact that you live in Mississippi should not make the difference as to how you're treated. You should get the same treatment in Mississippi, in Michigan, in Maryland, in Minnesota, in Missouri, all the M states for that matter. You should be able to be a full citizen in all of those places without any restriction. What the Congress is trying to do here is to hold the Southerners to the line and to say, okay, African Americans are free, and now they're citizens, and that means that you have to treat them fairly. Now, what Southerners are going to do, as we'll see here, is resist that in a variety of ways. What did the Reconstruction Act of 1867 do? It used the military to occupy the South to take over the society and make sure that Southerners were holding true to the purpose of the 14th Amendment. Explain the circumstances that led to the impeachment of President Johnson. This is one of those great battles of the day. Johnson is not going to back down. He continues to be a real fly in the ointment, if you will. He's vetoed the budget for the Freedmen's Bureau. He works against the 14th Amendment. He vetoes a Civil Rights Act. There's congressional overrides of vetoes for the first time in American history on that legislation. And eventually, the Congress decides that they want to set Johnson up to break a law. And so they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act, which Johnson is eventually going to break, and then he's impeached. But keep in mind, he's not found guilty. And that's good. Now, we might not like Johnson. We might think he's a horrible president, and I think he is. But we shouldn't impeach him. If impeachment becomes a popularity tool, instead of being a way of punishing inappropriate activities by a president, it's a dangerous thing. We don't want impeachment to become something that's used willy-nilly as a way of simply saying, Mr. Johnson, Mr. President, I beg your pardon, we don't like you. That shouldn't be the way impeachment is used. The 1868 election brings Ulysses Grant to the power of the presidency. The 15th Amendment grants voting rights, and it says that you may not restrict voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We will notice our Southerners. Okay, going with my main theme over here. The constitutional changes of Reconstruction led to conflicts over new definitions of citizenship. So you would think that the 14th and 15th Amendment fairly clearly say that this is what makes a citizen, and this is the conditions under which you can't restrict the rights of citizens to vote. African Americans, unfortunately, are going to be restricted in many ways. We're going to see all sorts of nice tricks by Southern society. Poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests and all these things that are used as a way of keeping African Americans out of the voting booth. In a sense, that's why the troops are there as a part of the Reconstruction Act of 1867, to try and pressure Southern civilization to allow African Americans to vote. And in states where African Americans do vote, and in some states where they have an advantage, we are going to see members of Congress elected who are African American. We're going to see governors, lieutenant governors. We're going to see state houses. But that takes a state, A, where you have a large African American population that can vote, and B, the Southern population allowing them to vote. and those things are not always guaranteed. The women's rights split. We're going to see the women's rights movement break into two here over the issue of whether or not the issue of African American votes is more important than women votes. In other words, if women don't get the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, should they support the 15th Amendment? We'll see a breakdown in the national suffrage movement over this. It wouldn't have taken much extra. All you would have had to do was pin "and gender" or something like that on the end of the specifications of the 15th Amendment, and that would have been solved, but that was considered to be too radical at the day. A carpetbagger is someone who comes down from an area into another area and tries to take advantage of poor economic conditions and buy up the place. It specifically was about Northerners who came down into the South after the war and tried to buy up land or resources or businesses. A scalawag is a Southerner who supports the Northern cause. A scalawag. That's a fine-sounding insult, though. Steps taken by radical Republicans as part of their programs in the South. They're going to do everything they can with a limited budget, unfortunately. They're going to open schools and they're going to push voting as much as they can, and we're going to see some great achievements in the South, but it's a temporary thing. As long as the military is there and as long as there's a strong Northern presence, Reconstruction does have a chance. When it ends in 1877, the radical agenda, unfortunately, is going to end with it. Explain the roles played by each of the following. Blanche Bruce and Hiram Revels were both elected to the Senate from Mississippi. African Americans elected from a previously slaveholding state. Quite an achievement. Churches. Churches are central to African American society during the era after the Civil War. They serve as school, worship area, voting booth, community center. It's no coincidence that the Klan targets churches. Without churches, African American communities often lack their nucleus. Sharecropping is the economic system of the day. African Americans, unfortunately, are in a situation just like they were economically beforehand, because they're going to be asked to work on cotton plantations and to do pretty much the same task that they've been doing all the way along in the South, this time in exchange for a share of the crop, sharecropping as it is, and for room and board as well. Now, generally speaking, this is not a way to get rich. If there's a poor harvest out there, you might find yourself piled under debt. The difference between a redeemer and a member of the Klan. A redeemer is someone who subtly resists Reconstruction. That is to say, I own a store, and I don't sell things to people I don't want to sell things to. Or I own a bank, and I just never loan money to people who I don't want to loan money to. A member of the Klan is someone who's going to get out there and violently oppose African Americans or anyone who might support them. And that's going to be a much more confrontational attitude. The Klan is going to flourish during this period. What factors combine to end Reconstruction? Well, a number of them, but let's focus here. Number one, Northerners got tired of the effort. In a sense, they've been waging this battle against slavery for decades. They finally fought a war for it. They spent 15 years, or I beg your pardon, more like 12 years after the Civil War trying to push the ideas that they believed in, and they lost enthusiasm and eventually ran out of money for the cause and walked away from it. Now, at the same point, we should point out that Southerners put up a very, very stiff resistance and convinced Northerners that eventually you're simply not going to change our ways. It's one thing to say that legally you've changed the identity of African Americans, but it's another thing to say that socially and economically we have to change, that we have to somehow accommodate a complete redoing of the society in order to make the South more like the North. So with that, in 1877, the troops, the last ones, are removed from the South, and what begins is this long night of segregation. If you're an African American living in the South after 1877, it's very likely that you don't get the opportunity to vote, that your economic situation has not changed very much, and that socially you are seen as being a secondary class. It's a society with numerous Jim Crow laws or black codes that are going to segregate African Americans away from the white society. Many whites are going to do everything they can in the South to continue on the good old South that existed prior to the Civil War. So when we go back to our central theme of no changes in social and economic conditions, that's what we're talking about. And in a way, the political ones aren't changed much either if you're not getting the actual opportunity to vote. That's the end of our unit, ladies and gentlemen. There are 3 videos. I hope you watch them all. Have a good night.